"If you don't like your wife, I can be the second," said the Apache woman, but the cowboy had no wife. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The late summer sun settled low across the New Mexico frontier, turning the dry brush into long stretches of pale gold, while Judd Marston guided his horse along a narrow trail that cut between uneven rocks and low hills. His shirt clung to his back from sweat, and a layer of dust coated his sleeves and boots. He had spent the entire day riding the far edge of his land, checking boundary posts and making sure no cattle had wandered off, and the strain of the heat pressed on him with each mile. His jaw stayed tight, the old habit he carried from years of keeping his emotions sealed, especially ever since the feud that took his younger brother and pushed him away from anyone who might ask about it. Judd preferred distance, preferred silence. He kept to himself in a weather-worn cabin tucked between the hills, riding into town only when he needed supplies, avoiding questions and avoiding the memories he didn't want to stir. The isolation made the days manageable. The quiet let him feel like nothing could drag him back into the life he'd left behind. As he approached the last stretch toward home, something caught his eye near the dried wash below, a shape slumped against a rock that didn't fit the usual scatter of brush and stone. At first he thought it was a stray animal or someone's abandoned pack, but when he slowed his horse and looked again, he saw the faint movement of a person trying to breathe. A sharp pull of caution tightened in his chest. He scanned the land for signs of an ambush. Nothing moved, no tracks nearby, just one figure, small and still. Judd dismounted with a deliberate pace, placing each boot carefully on the ground, his hand brushing the handle of his revolver out of habit, not aggression. He'd lived too long on the frontier to approach anything blindly. Still, something about the motionless shape tugged at him, a recognition of what it meant when someone was too weak even to call out. He stepped closer and finally saw her clearly. A young Apache woman sat collapsed against a pale boulder, her breathing shallow, her head bowed. Her long black hair hung in uneven strands, partly braided, partly loose from struggle. Her deerskin dress was torn across the chest where the stitches had ripped open, leaving a deep neckline she tried to hide by pulling one arm across herself, though her arm shook with exhaustion. Dirt covered her bare shoulders. A bruise spread across her cheek. Her lips were cracked from dehydration. She looked like she had been running for hours and finally ran out of strength. Judd felt his stomach tighten. He recognized desperation when he saw it. The last time he had seen someone this depleted had been during the worst years of the feud, when his brother had taken a wound Judd couldn't fix. The memory pushed at him, unwanted, but it also made him step closer rather than turn away. He crouched beside her, making sure she could see his hands. His voice came low. "You hurt." Her eyelids lifted slowly, revealing eyes clouded by exhaustion and fear. She swallowed with difficulty before whispering something that didn't match anything he expected to hear. "If you don't like your wife," she said quietly, each word trembling, "I could be the second one." The sentence startled Judd so sharply he felt his pulse jump. Confusion hit him first, then a wave of anger. Not at her, but at whoever made her think that was the only way she could survive. She didn't meet his eyes. She looked downward, bracing herself for rejection or worse. Her posture wasn't suggestive. It was desperate. It was someone expecting to be traded like property. "I don't have a wife," Judd said, steadying his tone so she wouldn't panic. "And I'm not taking you as anything." She blinked as if she didn't fully understand, and her head dropped forward slightly from dizziness. Judd hesitated, struggling with the decision forming in his mind. Taking her to his cabin meant responsibility. It meant bringing someone into the one place he kept free from memories and interruptions. But leaving her here meant she would die. The land was too harsh, the night coming too fast, and she could barely stay upright. He moved carefully, placing a hand on her shoulder to test whether she could stand. Her body leaned forward instantly, unable to hold itself up. She grabbed weakly at the rock behind her, but her fingers slipped. Judd stepped in, catching her before she hit the ground. Her weight pressed against him, warm and unsteady, the torn edge of her dress brushing against his shirt. She tried to shift away out of embarrassment, but she didn't have the strength to do more than tremble in his arms. He steadied her, speaking quietly. "You're all right. I'm taking you somewhere safe." She didn't argue, didn't ask where. Her eyes closed briefly, and her breath came in small, uneven pulls of air. Judd lifted her with both arms, adjusting her carefully so he wouldn't worsen the bruises on her sides. She felt feather light from exhaustion, but her body shook with each movement. He carried her to his horse and settled her sideways first, making sure her legs were stable. When he mounted behind her, he positioned her so that her back rested against his chest and one arm could support her waist. She tried to keep her hand on the saddle horn, but her grip failed, so Judd curled his hand over hers to keep it steady. Her breathing warmed the fabric of his shirt as she leaned into him out of necessity. As he guided the horse toward home, Judd's mind worked through the situation with a seriousness he didn't show on his face. She had clearly fled someone. Maybe raiders. Maybe men looking to sell her. Whatever happened, it had been recent. Her injuries weren't old. The torn dress made that clear. She would need water, food, rest, and someone to keep watch tonight in case whoever chased her wasn't far behind. The guilt he carried from losing his brother stirred faintly. The old belief that he couldn't save anyone when it counted. He shoved the thought aside. This time he wasn't too late. This time he could act before someone slipped away from him. The cabin finally came into view, a small wooden structure tucked between low hills, the porch dim in the fading light. Judd's grip on the reins loosened in relief. He felt the woman's breathing grow even more shallow against him, as if she was seconds from losing consciousness. "You're almost there," he murmured, unsure whether she could hear him. She didn't answer, but her head rested closer against his shoulder, and for a moment Judd felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't allowed in years. Not hope, not affection, just the quiet realization that the empty cabin wouldn't be empty tonight. The horse stepped into the yard, and Judd tightened his arm around her one last time before lifting her down gently, ready to carry her over the threshold of a home no one but him had entered in years. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew he wasn't letting her die out there alone. And that choice set everything else in motion. Judd pushed open the cabin door with his shoulder while holding the Apache woman in his arms, the lantern on the small table casting a steady glow over the wooden walls. The room was simple. Bed in the corner, potbelly stove near the door, shelves lined with tools and supplies, and a single chair worn down from years of use. He set her down gently on the edge of the bed, making sure her legs were supported and her back rested against the thin pillow. She winced when her side touched the blanket, and Judd took note of every reaction, trying to understand which injuries needed immediate attention. She blinked slowly, eyes adjusting to the light, taking in the surroundings with hesitation. Her breathing remained unsteady, but she was conscious enough to study the cabin's interior, as if searching for signs she was safe. Her voice came out in a faint rasp. "Where is this?" "My place," Judd answered, bringing a cup of water from the table. He held it to her lips carefully. "Drink slow." She obeyed, her throat moving as she swallowed each sip. When she lowered her gaze, he noticed how tightly she held the torn front of her dress, gripping it with determination despite her shaking fingers. She was trying to maintain dignity while her body betrayed how exhausted she was. Judd crouched beside the bed, meeting her eyes. "I'm going to fix that tear so you don't have to hold it. But not before you tell me if someone's chasing you. I need to know what might show up at my door tonight." Her expression tightened with fear, but she didn't look away. She took a breath that trembled at the edges, then spoke. "Men from the foothills came 2 nights ago. They took everything from the place I was staying. I hid in the rocks until they left, but one of them saw me run. They followed for a while." Her voice dropped lower. "I think they still might." Judd felt his stomach drop, not out of fear for himself, but because bringing her here meant he now shared the danger. Still, he didn't regret the decision. He had lived with danger before. He could handle it now. He stood, crossed the room, and checked a rifle by the door, making sure it was loaded. The woman watched him with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "What's your name?" Judd asked without turning. "Sora," she said quietly. "My family call me that." He nodded once, storing the name firmly in his mind. Judd Marston, he offered in return, knowing she deserved to know who had taken her in. He moved back to her side with a basin and a folded cloth soaked in cool water. When he pressed the cloth lightly against the bruise on her cheek, she sucked in a breath but didn't pull away. He worked with slow, steady movements, watching her reactions carefully. She flinched when he reached her shoulder where the dress had ripped. The edges of the tear were stretched and uneven, revealing more of her than she wanted, and Sora's cheeks warmed with embarrassment. "I'll step back while you adjust the blanket," Judd said, his tone gentle but firm. He turned away immediately, focusing on the stove to give her a moment. He heard the soft rustle of fabric, her breathing uneven as she tried to cover herself properly. When she finished, she murmured, "Okay." He returned with a strip of cloth he had cut from an old shirt. "Just to hold the dress together for tonight," he explained. "You tell me if anything hurts when I tie it." Sora nodded. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved the blanket aside, just enough for him to reach the broken seam. Judd tied the cloth in place with careful restraint, not looking anywhere he didn't need to. She studied his face closely, as if trying to decide whether he was the kind of man she could trust. When he finished, he stepped back again. "That'll hold until morning." Her shoulders loosened a bit, not fully, but enough to show relief. "Why help me like this?" she asked softly. Her voice wasn't suspicious, just tired, confused, and searching. Judd leaned back on the chair across from her. "Found enough bodies in my time to know one more doesn't fix anything," he said honestly. "And you didn't get here by choice." The answer seemed to settle something inside her. She pulled the blanket a little higher over her legs and looked around the room again. Her gaze stopped on the shelf near the stove where a small wooden carving sat. A horse with uneven legs, clearly made by someone who had been learning the craft. She tilted her head. "Yours?" she asked. Judd followed her eyes. "My brother made that when we were younger," he said. His voice thinned for a moment, not from emotion he showed outwardly, but from the memory pushing forward. "Haven't touched it since." Sora nodded slowly, sensing the weight in his tone without asking for details. "He's gone." "Yes," Judd said, simple and direct. Sora absorbed the answer quietly, as if understanding loss was something familiar to her as well. The lantern flickered slightly as a gust of wind pressed against the cabin walls. Judd stood and walked to the window, looking out toward the darkening hills. He checked the distance, the shadows, the ridgelines where someone could approach unseen. He didn't believe the men had followed her all the way here yet, but he wasn't about to take chances. Sora watched him. "You think they'll come?" "I think people after something don't stop easy," he replied. "But if they do show up, they're not getting inside." She wrapped her arms around herself, not from fear alone, but from the strange comfort that came from hearing someone declare protection without expecting anything in return. Her voice softened. "I thought you might send me away once I could walk." Judd turned from the window, his expression steady and unflinching. "You're not going anywhere tonight. You're hurt, you can barely stand, and it's getting cold. You stay here until you can keep yourself upright." Sora breathed out slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing a little more. She looked at him again, really studying him. The worn shirt, the tired eyes, the controlled movements, the way he stood like someone who had spent years expecting trouble but refusing to run from it. "Thank you," she whispered. Judd nodded once. "Rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." He placed an extra blanket at the foot of the bed, tightened the latch on the door, and set another piece of wood into the stove to keep the cabin warm through the night. Sora lay back carefully, resting her head against the pillow, watching him through half-closed eyes. The room fell into a steady quiet, broken only by the soft crackle of the stove and the slow rhythm of Sora's breathing as she drifted toward sleep. Judd remained in the chair with his rifle leaning against his leg, his eyes fixed on the door and the dark outside. He wasn't used to sharing his cabin. He wasn't used to letting someone sleep within reach. But tonight, he didn't feel the usual weight of isolation pressing against him. Someone was here. Someone who needed protection. and he wasn't going to let anything come through that door. The wind settled outside as night deepened, and the cabin took on a stillness Judd rarely felt when he wasn't alone. He sat in the chair beside the door with his rifle balanced against his leg, his elbows resting on his knees as he kept watch. The lantern's light flickered across the wooden floorboards, stretching pale shadows toward the bed where Sora slept under the blanket he had tucked around her earlier. Her breathing had steadied, no longer ragged, but each rise and fall of her chest showed how hard the past days had been on her. Judd shifted his weight quietly, the chair creaking under him as he studied the way she curled slightly on her side, holding the repaired seam of her dress as if she feared it might come undone again. He wondered how long she'd been running, how far she'd traveled, and why no one else was with her. He knew she said her family was gone, but she had given no details, and he hadn't pressed because she could barely stay upright. Now, in the quiet, he wondered whether she had survived more than she let on. His eyes drifted to the window, checking the ridgeline again. Nothing moved outside except for the shadows cast by the moon. Still, he didn't relax, not fully. He had told Sora he wouldn't let anyone through the door, and he meant it. He kept his thoughts sharp, forcing away the memories that tried to creep in now that the house held more than him. A soft rustle came from the bed, and Sora stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light. She turned her head toward him, confusion passing across her face before recognition took hold. "You stayed awake," she said quietly, her voice still rough from exhaustion. Judd nodded without shifting in his chair. "Wasn't going to sleep with you in that condition." Her gaze lowered to the blanket, her fingers brushing the stitched cloth he had tied earlier. "Did anyone come?" "No," he answered. "Quiet night so far." A small tension left her shoulders. "Good." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't mean to say things earlier. About wives." Judd looked at her directly, not unkindly. "You were scared. People say things when they think they're out of choices." She held his gaze longer this time, as if trying to figure out how much she had revealed by mistake. "I didn't know who you were," she said. "I thought maybe you'd hand me back to whoever was chasing me." "That's not who I am," Judd replied. "I don't trade people, and I don't let trouble walk out with someone who can't defend themselves." His tone wasn't harsh, but it left no room for doubt. Sora absorbed his words thoughtfully, then asked a question she had avoided until now. "Why do you live way out here?" "Alone." Judd stiffened slightly. He hadn't planned to talk about it tonight, but he knew she deserved something in return for the trust she'd already given him by staying here. "My brother's gone," he said plainly. "Things happened after that. Bad things. I left town and didn't go back. Easier this way." She nodded slowly, not pushing for details he didn't offer. "I understand losing people," she murmured. "I ran with others for a time after my family died. We kept moving. Then the group broke apart. Some taken, some vanished. I stayed in the hills, hunting small game, trying to survive. Those men, they came across my tracks by chance." Judd listened carefully, filing away every detail. She wasn't just passing through. She had been alone for longer than he'd assumed. He saw the effect in the way she watched the walls, the door, the window. She had learned to expect danger everywhere. She shifted, adjusting the blanket. Her face tensed again when a soreness at her ribs caught her off guard. Judd stood and approached the bed slowly, setting the rifle aside. "Let me look at that," he said, keeping his tone even. "If your ribs are cracked, I need to bind them so you can breathe easier." Sora hesitated, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. She remembered earlier when the torn dress left her exposed, and the instinct to guard herself pressed hard on her. Judd noticed the hesitation and stepped back half a pace. "I won't uncover anything you don't want," he said. "Just tell me where it hurts." She exhaled, her trust building in small steps. She lifted the edge of the blanket enough for him to see the side of her torso where a deep bruise spread across her ribcage. The beadwork of her dress had scraped the skin raw when she fled through the rocks. Judd reached for the basin again, refreshing the cloth with cool water. This time he sat on the edge of the bed, but kept a respectful distance, letting her adjust her blanket however she needed. When he pressed the cloth gently against the bruise, Sora's breath hitched, but she forced herself to stay still. "How far did you run before you collapsed?" Judd asked quietly. Almost a full day, she said. I tried to reach the river, but I didn't make it before sunset. He nodded. That explained the level of dehydration, the dizziness, the state of her wounds. As he changed the compress, she watched him closely, her eyes focused not on his hands, but on the calm way he worked, as if tending to another person wasn't foreign to him, even though he had lived alone for years. You don't act like someone who wants to be alone, she said softly. Judd's jaw tightened. Wanting and needing are different things. Sora absorbed the statement quietly. She didn't ask what he meant. After making sure the cold cloth eased the swelling, Judd bandaged her ribs with a long strip of linen from the shelf. He wrapped it snugly, but not tightly, checking her breathing after each pull of the fabric. She kept her eyes on his face, watching every shift in his expression as if trying to decide whether he was truly safe. When he finished, he sat back again. You'll breathe easier now. The bruise will take days to heal. She let her hand rest lightly over the bandage. No one has helped me like this in a long time. Judd didn't answer. He stood, walked to the door, and checked the latch one more time before returning to his chair. Sora watched him move, observing how he kept a constant awareness of every entry point, as if he expected danger at any second. She spoke again, quieter this time. If they follow my tracks here, you could get killed. Judd didn't flinch. I've had worse men try. Sora looked down at her hands. You didn't have to bring me into your home. He met her gaze, firm but calm. Leaving you out there wasn't an option. She settled into the pillow slowly, fatigue pulling hard at her limbs now that the adrenaline had faded. Judd dimmed the lantern, so the room softened into warm shadows. Before sleep drifted over her, she asked one final question. What will we do in the morning? Judd leaned back, eyes sharpening with purpose. First thing, we find out how close those men are. Then we make a plan that keeps you alive. Sora closed her eyes, reassured by the certainty in his voice. The stove glowed softly. The night held steady, and Judd remained in the chair, awake, guarding the woman who had unexpectedly turned his empty cabin into something that felt different tonight. Gray light crept through the cabin window at dawn, drawing thin outlines across the wooden floor as Judd rose from the chair. His back ached from the long night, but he didn't let the stiffness slow him. He checked the rifle first, then the window, then the door, following a routine he had built over years of living alone with only caution to keep him safe. Outside, the hillside held still under the pale morning sky. No prints, no shadows, no sign of movement. But he knew danger didn't always announce itself, and those men Sora fled from would not forget the sight of a lone woman slipping out of their reach. Sora stirred quietly on the bed, shifting beneath the blanket. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Judd standing near the door with the rifle in hand. Her body tensed briefly as if bracing for an order to leave, but he turned toward her with a calm expression that pulled her out of her fear. You slept through the night, he said, lowering the rifle. That's a good sign. Sora pushed herself up slowly, careful of her ribs. I didn't expect to sleep at all. Pain makes people pass out, Judd replied. Real sleep means you had enough safety in you to rest. She looked down at the blanket, taking in the unfamiliar feeling of waking somewhere protected. No cold ground, no threat waiting behind trees. The realization overwhelmed her for a short moment, and she pressed her fingers to her forehead to steady herself. Judd crossed the room, grabbing a tin cup and filling it with fresh water. When he handed it to her, she took it with both hands, drinking slowly. Her eyes drifted to the cabin interior again, noticing details she had been too weak to see the night before. The worn table, the tools neatly arranged on the shelf, the patched saddlebag in the corner, the way Judd kept everything organized and purposeful, as if every item had a reason to be exactly where it sat. Do you live here all year? She asked, wanting to understand the man who brought her into his only shelter. Most seasons, he said. Winter hits hard in these hills, but I stay unless something forces me out. What would force you out? Judd secured the chair near the table, trying to keep the conversation steady without showing the weight behind his answer. Trouble with people, or the past catching up. Sora's gaze softened. You carry that alone. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he pulled the chair closer to the bed so she wouldn't have to crane her neck. Let's check those ribs again before we do anything else. She sat straighter, lifting the blanket enough for him to see the bandage. Her cheeks warmed slightly, but she didn't shy away this time. Trust didn't come fast, but it was forming in small, steady pieces. Judd unwound the fabric carefully, his fingers steady while hers gripped the edge of the blanket. The bruise had darkened overnight, stretching across her side in uneven shades of purple and red. "Hurts?" he asked. "When I breathe deep," she answered. "That's expected. Nothing's broken, but you're going to feel it for days." He pressed lightly to check swelling, adjusting his touch when her breath hitched. When he finished, he bound the ribs again with fresh linen. Sora watched the way he moved, precise, quiet, focused. She wondered if he had tended his brother's injuries once, or someone else's, because he handled each step like someone who understood how fragile a wounded person could be. "What do you plan for today?" she asked softly. Judd stood, wiped his hands clean, and moved toward the door. "I'm going to track the ridge. If those men are anywhere near, I'll see the signs." Sora stiffened. "You'll go alone? You're not in any shape to climb hills," he said plainly. "I'll be quick." Her fingers clutched the blanket in a flash of panic she tried to hide. "If they follow me here." "They won't touch you," Judd said, his tone dropping lower, firmer, as he checked his holster. "Not while I'm breathing." The certainty in his voice stopped her fear for a moment. Still, she asked something he didn't expect. "Why would you risk your life for someone you found on the ground?" He paused, one hand on the doorframe. "Because someone should have helped my brother when he needed it," he said, not turning toward her. "And no one did." Sora absorbed the truth without speaking. Judd stepped outside, leaving the door slightly ajar so she would hear if he returned quickly. She looked around the cabin once more, realizing she had never stayed in a place built for calm. The quiet was strange. The warmth from the stove felt unfamiliar. She belonged to no one and nowhere for so long that sitting in a chair rather than crouching behind a tree felt almost unreal. While she waited for Judd, she explored the small cabin with careful steps, leaning on the table for balance when the pain in her ribs tightened. She saw a narrow wooden box beneath the shelf and lifted the lid. Inside were small items: a broken pocket watch, a worn belt buckle, a handful of coins, and a piece of folded cloth embroidered with simple blue stitching. She touched it with her fingertips, recognizing it as something handmade, personal, saved despite its insignificance. She placed it back exactly as she found it, understanding it belonged to the memory he guarded. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour before Judd returned. He stepped inside quietly but with purpose. Sora straightened at once, searching his face for any sign of danger. "Tracks," he said. "3 riders. Passed through the ridge before sunrise." She felt her breath catch. "Did they see the cabin?" "Doesn't look like it." He set his rifle by the door and removed his hat, brushing dust from his hair. "But they were close enough. Close enough, I'm not letting you step outside today." Sora clenched her hands. "They're not giving up." "No," Judd said. "Men like that don't walk away from what they think they own." A sharp fear crossed her expression, but Judd continued quickly, already planning. "I'm moving the horses to the lower corral tonight, out of sight. I'll set a watch on the ridge when the sun drops. You stay inside where you're covered." She opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it. Her ribs, her exhaustion, the memory of how she collapsed in the wash, all of it reminded her she couldn't fight in her state. But she needed something answered. "If they find us, what then?" Judd stepped closer, steady and sure, the boundary between them shifting just enough for her to feel safer. "Then they'll learn this is the wrong place to come." Sora inhaled slowly, letting the reassurance settle into her. "I don't want to bring trouble to your home," she said quietly. "You didn't bring trouble," Judd replied. "Trouble was already out there. You just crossed its path before I did." Her eyes stayed locked on his, and something subtle passed between them, an understanding that neither of them expected when the sun rose. Judd turned toward the stove and struck a match, lighting a small flame to boil coffee and heat water. Sora watched him with new clarity, seeing how he moved with purpose for someone who had spent years alone. She noticed how he checked the door latch each time he passed it, how he glanced toward the window whenever wind rustled the brush, how his presence filled the small cabin without crowding her. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "For now," he said, pouring water into a cup. "You heal. Let me handle the rest." She nodded. "And later," Judd said, handing her the warm cup, "we decide what's worth fighting for." Sora wrapped her hands around the cup, feeling the heat seep into her palms. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was drifting without direction. The day ahead held danger, but she wasn't facing it alone. Not anymore. The morning settled into a tense quiet that stretched through the cabin as Judd finished preparing a small meal. The stove gave off a warm heat that kept the air steady, and the smell of boiled coffee mixed with the faint scent of dried herbs he had thrown into a pot for Sora's pain. She sat near the table with careful posture, trying not to strain her ribs, her hands wrapped around the cup he'd given her. Though her breathing was steadier, every movement reminded her how fragile her body still was. Judd kept glancing through the window, noting changes in the landscape, the shift of shadows, the pattern of wind across the brush, the faint marks on the ridge he had tracked earlier. His instincts worked constantly, measuring risk, calculating time, deciding how long they could stay before the men who followed Sora narrowed the distance. He didn't discuss the worst possibilities with her yet. She needed strength first, not worry. "Eat while it's warm," he said, setting a plate near her elbow. "You'll hold yourself better if you get something in you." Sora took a small bite of the beans and bread, trying not to let the soreness in her body show. After a moment, she glanced at Judd's hands, scarred from past fights, sunburned from long rides, steady in a way that told her he had survived more than he ever admitted. "You've dealt with men like the ones chasing me before, haven't you?" she asked quietly. Judd paused, then nodded once. "Enough times to know they don't back down unless someone makes them." "Did you hurt them?" she asked. "I stopped them," he answered. "One way or another." He didn't elaborate. Sora didn't push. She sensed the boundary of the topic and shifted to something else that weighed on her. "How far is the nearest town?" she asked. "Half a day's ride," Judd replied. "Small place. Folks keep to their own business unless trouble comes knocking." "Would they help if the men find me?" "They'd help if they saw you were in danger," he said. "But they won't see anything if those men show up on this land. They'd hit here before thinking about going public." Sora lowered her eyes, taking in the truth she had feared. Judd set his coffee aside and pulled his hat from the hook near the door. "I'm checking the lower trail. I'll be back before the sun rises too high." She stiffened instantly. "I don't want you out there alone." "I know," he said gently. "But if I don't go, we'll be surprised instead of prepared." Sora swallowed hard. "What if they see you?" "I won't give them a chance." Before she could object further, Judd grabbed the rifle and stepped onto the porch. Sora moved toward the window, watching him disappear over the slope toward the creek bed. She stood there for a long time, gripping the windowsill to steady both her balance and her thoughts. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. Her ribs ached, but she stayed upright, unable to rest without knowing whether Judd was safe. Every rustle outside made her shoulders tense. Every shadow made her heart jump. She wasn't helpless. She had tracked, hunted, and fought before, but her current weakness left her trapped inside the cabin with only her fear to keep her company. Finally, the sound of footsteps approached. Judd pushed the door open with the same careful motion he always used, but the look in his eyes carried a new intensity. "You found something," Sora said immediately, stepping away from the window. "Tracks closer than before," Judd answered, shutting the door behind him. They circled the ridge, doubled back, then headed north. "They're searching, not just riding through." Sora's breath hitched. "How many?" "3. Same as last night." She wrapped her arms around her waist as if trying to hold herself steady. "They won't stop until they catch me." Judd stepped toward her, his voice firm. "They're not catching you." Her eyes lifted to his, searching for certainty. He softened his tone slightly. "We need to plan ahead. You can't ride yet, not with your ribs. Your strength is improving, but you'll slow down fast. They'll catch us in the open." Sora sank slowly onto the chair, realizing the truth of what he said. "So we stay." For now, Judd said, but we hide signs of you. If they come near, I'll make sure they don't know you're here. She hesitated. What will you tell them if they come to the door? That depends on how they approach, he answered, adjusting the rifle strap. But I won't open it without a reason. Sora studied him as he moved through the cabin, rearranging items that belonged to him and removing anything that might hint a woman was inside. He placed her shoes under the bed, folded the blanket she had used into one of the storage crates, and pushed the chair she sat in back into its usual place. He worked with a purpose that left no detail untouched. She watched him carefully. You've had to hide someone before, she said. Judd paused, turning slightly toward her. Once, he admitted, not like this. But I've had to protect someone when the wrong people came looking. What happened? She asked quietly. They didn't find what they came for. And the person got out safe. Sora's tension loosened a fraction. She looked down at the bandages across her ribs. If you weren't here yesterday, I wouldn't have survived another hour. Judd didn't speak at first. He set the rifle back near the door and moved to stand across from her, his arms resting loosely at his sides. You were barely conscious. You wouldn't have seen those riders come over the ridge. She lowered her eyes. Why did they chase me so far? Judd sat on the edge of the table, leaning forward slightly. That's something I didn't ask yet, he said. And now I need to. Sora took a slow breath, bracing herself. I was staying near the mountain pass with 2 others. We hid supplies, food, a little money, some clothes. Those men found our place. They wanted everything. They took the other 2 women. I escaped through the rocks. They followed because they wanted all of us. Judd absorbed her words with a steady calm. Women being taken means they intend to sell you, he said plainly. Yes, Sora replied. Or worse. A sharp tension moved through Judd's shoulders, a flash of anger not directed at her, but at the men who treated people as property. Then they're not leaving this hilltop with you, he said. I'll make sure of that. For the first time since arriving, Sora reached out and placed her hand on his forearm, her touch light, but steady. I don't want you to get hurt because of me. He looked at her hand, then at her face. You didn't choose this. I'm not letting them decide your fate. Her hand lingered for a moment before she pulled it back. Judd stood and moved toward the shelf to gather supplies. Tonight, I'll stay outside the cabin. If anything moves near the ridge, I'll know. You lock the door behind me when I go. Sora's voice softened. What if they come when you're alone out there? Then I'll handle them before they reach the cabin. She swallowed hard. I don't want to lose the only person who's helped me. Judd's expression shifted, not softened but focused. You're not losing anyone. Not tonight. Sora watched him prepare, watched the way he checked each item without rushing, watched the responsibility settle on him like it belonged there. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel like she was running alone. Judd opened the door and stepped out into the dimming evening, turning back once to meet her eyes. Stay quiet. Stay inside. And remember, you're safe until I say otherwise. Sora closed the door behind him, pressing her hand to the wood as his footsteps faded toward the ridge. The cabin fell silent again, but not with fear alone. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen to stand between her and danger, and he was waiting on the ridge for whatever came next. Evening settled across the ridge with a slow dimming of color, leaving the land coated in muted shades of gray and blue. Judd crouched behind a cluster of scrub about 20 yards from the cabin, rifle balanced across his knees, eyes fixed on the tree line below. The air cooled steadily as the sun disappeared, and the quiet around him sharpened every sound. A distant hawk, shifting brush, the creak of his own leather belt when he shifted. He scanned the landscape again, looking for movement, dust trails, or reflected metal. Nothing appeared, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. He knew the men hunting Sora had determination, and that determination came from greed, cruelty, or both. He had seen men like that ride for miles to reclaim what they believed they owned. Inside the cabin, Sora sat on the bed with her back against the wooden wall, listening for Judd's footsteps, though she knew he wouldn't make any sound she could detect. She held the blanket over her lap to keep warm, but the cold wasn't what tightened her chest. She hated waiting in the dark while someone else took the risk. Still, she followed his instruction and remained indoors, knowing she would slow him down or get caught in crossfire if she tried to help from outside. She decided to keep her hands busy so her thoughts wouldn't spiral. On the small table, she found a leather strap Judd used to bind tools, and she examined the stitching, noticing how precise each thread was. She touched the edge of the strap, thinking about all the things she didn't know about Judd, where he grew up, whether he had friends left in town, or why he chose a life so far from people. He had shared pieces of himself, but every piece hinted at deeper hurts he didn't show. Her ribs ached as she stood carefully and moved to the window. She didn't open the curtain, just parted it enough to look at the slope. She couldn't see Judd, but that didn't surprise her. He knew how to move unseen. She whispered under her breath, not intending anyone to hear, "Don't get hurt." Outside, Judd adjusted his position when a faint crunch reached his ears. The sound wasn't animal-light, it had weight. Slow steps. Judd raised the rifle, keeping the barrel steady toward the direction of the noise. He felt his pulse shift, not fast but alert, every muscle waiting for confirmation. Then he heard again, closer. A deliberate step, followed by the soft drag of something brushing dirt. He braced himself. Another sound followed, but not on the ground, above. A crow settled on a dead branch, shaking the tree. Judd lowered the rifle slightly, keeping his breath even. The moment of tension passed, but it left him even more alert. As he looked across the ridge, he noticed something he hadn't seen earlier when tracking, the imprint of a wagon wheel far to the north. Not close enough to be immediate danger, but close enough to suggest more movement in the area. If those three riders weren't alone, he needed to know before anything came near the cabin. He waited another long minute, then rose slowly and made his way down toward the lower slope, moving in a crouch to avoid being outlined against the sky. His boots made almost no sound against the dirt. When he reached a narrow opening between two rocks, he froze again, scanning the far clearing. There, two horses tied loosely to a mesquite tree, both saddled, both restless. No riders in sight. Judd's jaw tightened. "Close," he whispered under his breath. He retreated up the ridge, mindful of every footfall. The moment he reached the cover of the shrubs again, he breathed out once, long and controlled. Now he had proof. The men had doubled back. They were tracking her, following any sign she may have left. Back in the cabin, Sora heard the door latch shift. Her chest clenched in panic until she heard Judd's low exhale as he stepped inside. Relief washed over her shoulders before she even turned toward him. "You found them," she said, reading his expression before he spoke. "Not all three," Judd replied, closing the door firmly. "But two of them are camped a ways north. They're scouting." Sora tightened her grip on the blanket. "They'll come in the night." Judd didn't argue. "Possible." Her voice grew quieter. "And the third?" "Didn't see him," Judd answered, and the seriousness in his voice made her skin prickle. "He might be circling somewhere else." Sora inhaled slowly. "You should take me somewhere they can't find me." "I'm slowing you down." "You're staying put," Judd said firmly. "I'm not bringing you out there with broken ribs when three armed men want you alive." Sora lowered her eyes. "But you're one person, and I'm handling it," Judd replied, stepping closer, his tone steady but not harsh. "I've dealt with worse odds." Sora looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of uncertainty. She saw none. What she saw instead was a quiet steel she hadn't expected from the man who lived alone in the hills. Judd set his rifle near the door again and checked the ammunition in his revolver. "Tonight, I'll stay inside. I don't want you alone in case someone tries something quiet." Sora's shoulders eased slightly. "I don't like you being out there by yourself." "That makes two of us," Judd said. "So I'll keep watch from in here." She watched him as he moved to pour a small lantern full of oil, then lit it, letting the warm glow fill the cabin with a steady, comforting light. He closed the curtains tightly and checked the window locks. His movements carried purpose but not fear. He wasn't panicking. He was preparing. Sora settled back onto the bed, catching her breath as her ribs reminded her of their limits. If the men come here and see the cabin looks lived in, won't they assume someone's inside? Judd shook his head. "I erased most signs this morning. If they get close enough to suspect something, they'll still have to figure out whether I'm alone. They won't expect a wounded woman hiding inside. And they know I'm not one of them. Sora considered that, then spoke in a careful voice. If they force their way in, they won't, Judd said, cutting the sentence short before she could continue. If they try, I'll stop them before they step through the door. Her throat tightened, not with fear, but with the realization that he believed every word he said. She had survived many kinds of men. This one didn't speak to make her feel better. He spoke because he meant what he said. Judd pulled a chair next to the bed and sat with his rifle resting across his lap. You need sleep, he said. You're shaking more than earlier. Sora admitted the exhaustion with a small nod. She lay back slowly, her breathing uneven until she adjusted to a comfortable position. Judd lowered the lantern light, so the room dimmed, but not enough for him to lose visibility. Before her eyes closed, she whispered something she hadn't meant to say aloud. I feel safer with you here. Judd didn't look at her directly, but she saw the small shift in his expression, a hint of something unspoken, something reluctant but sincere. Good, he said quietly. You should. The stove crackled softly as night deepened around them. Judd kept his eyes fixed on the door, his grip on the rifle steady, the weight of responsibility settling squarely on his shoulders. Sora drifted into sleep with her hand resting near the blanket sewn earlier, the warmth of the lantern reflecting softly across her face. Outside, the hills held a silence that wasn't peaceful. Somewhere beyond the ridge, men searched the dark. Inside the cabin, Judd Marston waited for them, ready to protect the woman who had turned his empty life into something worth defending. The hours after sunset dragged forward in a slow, tense rhythm. Judd sat in the chair with his rifle resting across his lap, his eyes fixed on the door while the lantern cast steady light onto the floor. The sound of Sora's breathing filled the cabin in soft waves, each breath steady but shallow from the binding across her ribs. He listened for anything that didn't belong. Footsteps, snapped branches, shifting stones, but the darkness outside stayed strangely still. Every past night he'd spent alone in this cabin had been quiet like this, but tonight the silence felt different. It wasn't the empty kind. It carried weight. It held responsibility. It held another life he couldn't afford to lose. Sora stirred under the blanket, not fully waking, but shifting as discomfort from her ribs pushed through sleep. Judd rose from the chair, padded softly to the stove, and adjusted the wood so the heat wouldn't fade. He moved with care, so he wouldn't wake her, but she opened her eyes anyway when he turned back toward the bed. You're still awake, she murmured, her voice low. Enough noise outside to keep me on edge, Judd said, even though the hillside hadn't given him anything definite yet. He didn't want her more frightened than she already was. Sora pushed herself upright a little, stopping when the soreness caught her. Did you hear them? No, Judd said. But silence usually means movement somewhere else. She swallowed, anxiety tightening her shoulders. You think they're close? Judd nodded slightly. Closer than before, but not near the door. They're testing the area. Sora's gaze drifted around the cabin, noting the boarded window frame, the latch Judd reinforced earlier, the shadows from the lantern stretching toward the door. If they find out I'm here, she paused. Would you leave if it meant saving yourself? He met her eyes instantly. No. Her expression tightened. Why? We barely know each other. Judd took in a slow breath before answering. Because I know enough to see you didn't deserve what chased you. And because walking away from someone in your condition isn't something I could live with. She held his gaze longer this time, searching for any trace of pity or obligation. She saw neither. She saw the quiet certainty of a man who had already made his decision. Before she could respond, a faint sound crackled from outside, distant but sharp enough to cut through the calm. Both of them froze. Sora's hand tightened on the blanket. Judd angled his head toward the window, listening with the practiced stillness of someone who had survived dangerous nights before. What was that? Sora whispered. Metal, Judd said quietly. A spur or a buckle hitting rock. Her breathing quickened. Judd stepped toward the window, moving slowly enough that the floorboards didn't creak. He lifted the edge of the curtain a fraction of an inch, just enough for him to scan the dark slope. No bodies in sight, no horses, but he saw a shadow flicker near the lower tree line, a figure passing between brush, too far to identify. He lowered the curtain. One of them's out there. Sora's pulse raced. Are they coming up here? Not yet, Judd said. He's scouting the ridge. Might be looking for tracks. Might be testing how quiet the area is. She swallowed. And if he finds traces of us, then he'll signal the others, Judd replied. But he won't. His tone carried a finality that didn't come from overconfidence. It came from calculation. He walked to the table and checked the bullets in his belt, counting by touch. Sora watched every movement, absorbing the sense that Judd wasn't panicked. He was preparing. What will you do if he reaches the door? She asked. That depends, Judd said. If he comes quietly, he'll try to force the latch. If he comes fast, he'll hope to surprise whoever's inside. Sora's voice trembled. And if he tries either? Judd looked at her with an unshakable steadiness. He won't get past me. She opened her mouth to respond, but another noise shifted outside, closer this time. A deliberate crunch. Judd lifted his finger to his lips, signaling silence. Sora held her breath as he extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into near darkness except for the faint glow from the stove. He approached the door slowly, placing his ear against it. Sora could see his silhouette in the dim light, the strong lines of his shoulders tense but controlled. He waited, listening, identifying, judging distance. A second sound followed. Footsteps moving uphill, heavy enough to belong to a grown man. Judd's hand hovered over the rifle, though he didn't raise it yet. He needed to know if the rider was approaching the cabin or passing by. Minutes stretched with no new sound. Finally, Judd stepped back. He turned away, he whispered. Circling. Sora exhaled shakily. He knew someone was here. He suspects, Judd corrected. But suspicion isn't proof. Sora rubbed her hands together slowly, fighting the tremor in her fingers. Judd, what happens if they come all at once? He returned to the chair near her, keeping the rifle in hand. Then I choose the ground. They don't get to pick the moment. I do. She looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear. You're willing to fight 3 men for me. His expression didn't change. I'm willing to fight whoever thinks you're theirs to take. The weight of his words settled heavily between them. Sora shifted, easing herself closer to the edge of the bed so she could see him better. No one has ever defended me like this, she said softly. Judd didn't look away. Then it's about time someone did. A quiet moment passed between them, their eyes locked in a way that spoke of trust neither expected when this night began. For the first time, Sora wasn't thinking about running. She wasn't thinking about hiding. She was thinking about the man in front of her who refused to let anyone harm her. You should rest, Judd said eventually, though his voice carried a gentler tone than before. And you? She asked. I'll sleep later. He didn't add that he didn't intend to sleep at all. Sora eased back down onto the bed, keeping her gaze fixed on him until her eyelids grew heavy. If anything happens, she murmured, you call for me. Judd allowed a faint, rare softness to touch his voice. I will. Sora drifted into uneasy sleep, her trust lying heavy in the small space between them. Judd leaned back in the chair with his rifle resting against his chest, eyes open, posture rigid. The danger outside had grown closer. The night was not finished, but neither was Judd Marston. Someone out there wanted the woman in his cabin, and he was ready for them when they came looking. The sky outside shifted from deep black to a muted shade of blue-gray as dawn crept in, though the sun had not yet pushed over the ridge. Judd had stayed awake through the night, his back stiff from sitting in the chair, but his senses sharp. The sounds outside had changed as the darkness thinned. Less deliberate movement, more restless animals, the wind brushing through the brush. But he remained cautious. Men hunting someone didn't always wait for daylight to strike. Sora stirred awake, the dim light revealing her tired eyes and the lines of tension around her mouth. Her ribs throbbed, but the pain didn't feel as crippling as it had the night before. She pushed up on her elbows, noticing the shadows under Judd's eyes and the tightness in his shoulders. You didn't sleep at all. Judd shook his head slightly. not the night for it. Her gaze traced his face with a seriousness she had not shown before. I don't want you breaking yourself to keep me alive. I'm still standing, he said, adjusting the rifle. That's all that matters right now. She lowered her eyes. But you shouldn't have to carry this alone. He looked at her for a long moment, then spoke in a calm, grounded tone. I've been carrying things alone for years. This time, there's a reason. That makes it easier. The words hit her harder than she expected. Before she could respond, Judd stood and moved toward the window, lifting the curtain only a sliver. He scanned the ridge, the trees, the clearing where he saw the riders' tracks the day before. Anything? Sora asked quietly. Nothing moving yet, Judd said. But they didn't pack up and leave overnight. They're still out there. Sora stood slowly, bracing herself with the table. She walked to him with careful steps, enough to keep her balance steady. When she reached his side, she whispered, "If one of them finds this place, it won't be by accident." Judd nodded, "Which is why today we do something different." Sora's brows drew together. "What do you mean?" He let the curtain fall and turned toward her. "I'm not waiting for them to pick the ground anymore. I'm choosing it." Her heart jumped. "You're going after them?" Judd's expression was firm. "I'm going to cut their trail, find where they're camped, see what I'm dealing with. If I can scare them off, I will. If not, I'll be ready for what's coming." Fear flashed in Sora's eyes. "That's 3 armed men. You're one." "I've survived worse," he said quietly. "But I'm not walking into their fire. I'm watching, listening, gathering what we need to stay a step ahead." Sora clenched her hands. "I don't like the idea of you going out there without someone watching your back." "Someone will be," Judd said. "You." She stiffened. "How can I watch anything? I can barely breathe without pain." "You'll stay inside, watch the windows. If you see anyone coming from the south, you light the lantern 3 times and hang it in the window. If it's from the west, you shut the curtains and put the stool by the door. Those are signs I'll understand." Sora blinked. "Signals?" Judd nodded. "I need your eyes while I'm out. You're the only person I trust to give me truth about what's coming." Her throat tightened. "You trust me?" "With my life," Judd said without hesitation. The weight of the words settled in the space between them. Sora felt her breath shake, not from pain, but from a sudden realization that she had become more than a burden to him, more than a danger. She mattered. She was part of this fight. She stepped back, bracing against the table. "Tell me everything I need to watch for." Judd spent the next minutes walking her through the land, where the tree line thinned, which slope curved enough to hide riders, which shadows moved differently when men tried to sneak through brush. Sora listened intently, committing every detail to memory. She had lived on the land for years, tracking game and surviving off instinct. But Judd's sense of terrain was different, precise, tactical, shaped by the kind of violence she avoided but he had endured. When they finished, Judd holstered his revolver and checked the strap on his rifle. Sora watched with growing dread. "How long will you be gone?" "As long as it takes to see their setup," he said. "Not longer." Sora reached out suddenly and touched his sleeve, stopping him before he reached the door. "If they outnumber you, promise me you won't fight alone." Judd's eyes softened in a way she rarely saw. "I'm not looking for trouble. I'm looking to keep it from reaching this cabin. But if trouble finds me, I'm not letting it walk through that door while you're inside." Sora swallowed hard. "Don't die out there." He raised a hand slightly, hesitating before brushing 2 fingers lightly against the side of her arm. An instinctive gesture he didn't consider until after it happened. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from the sudden warmth of the contact. "I'm coming back," he said. She nodded once, her eyes locked on his. Then he opened the door, stepping into the cool morning air. The moment he vanished over the rise, Sora exhaled shakily and moved through the cabin with purpose, preparing the signals he told her to use. Outside, Judd moved quickly but quietly down the slope, keeping low as he crossed the ridge. The early light revealed faint prints in the dirt, fresh, spaced evenly, not wandering. The men were organized. That made them more dangerous. He tracked the prints along the lower trail until he reached a narrow canyon where rocks formed a natural funnel. He crouched behind a fallen log and scanned the clearing ahead. That's when he saw them. 2 horses tied to a dead branch. a small fire pit smoldering. Boot tracks, 3 sets, moving between the camp and the path. But the riders themselves were gone. Judd's jaw tightened. They had moved at dawn, which meant they were searching, which meant they were closer to the cabin than he had expected. He followed one set of tracks carefully, stepping only on hard stones to avoid leaving prints. The tracks angled toward the ridge, the same ridge overlooking his home. His heart pushed hard against his ribs, not from fear for himself, but from sudden, sharp concern for the woman watching the windows with bruised ribs and no weapon. Back in the cabin, Sora froze when she heard the faint rhythm of hooves carrying through the trees, soft, slow, deliberate. Her hand shook as she reached for the lantern, ready to send the signal Judd told her to use. But she couldn't see who the rider was. She pressed her back to the wall, listening, waiting for the shadow to come into view. On the ridge above her, Judd saw movement. One of the riders approaching the cabin from the south. Too close. Too soon. He lifted the rifle slowly and exhaled. He could make the shot from here, but firing meant announcing his position. It meant lighting the fuse he wanted to control. Below, the rider turned his horse toward the cabin door. Sora clenched the lantern, her pulse hammering. Judd raised the rifle, sighting the man's shoulder. His finger tightened on the trigger. Not yet. Not until he had no other choice. Sora stepped toward the window, ready to send the warning. Judd watched from above, poised between hesitation and action. The first true confrontation was seconds away, and the decision they made now would shape everything that followed. The rider's horse slowed as it reached the clearing, hooves sinking into the dry soil, while the man in the saddle scanned the cabin with the hard stare of someone searching for a reason to approach. Judd held his breath as he watched from the ridge above, his rifle braced against his shoulder. The rising sun edged over the horizon, spreading pale light across the slope, just enough to outline the shape of the man's gun belt and the long knife strapped to his thigh. Sora stood inside the cabin with the lantern gripped tightly in both hands, her ribs aching as she held her breath. She waited for a clear sign, something that would confirm Judd's instructions. If the man rode closer, she would raise the lantern 3 times. If he circled to the west, she would block the door. But for now, she stayed absolutely still, every sense tuned to the rider's next move. Outside, the man pulled his horse to a stop. He leaned forward slightly, studying the window as if expecting movement behind the curtain. Judd felt his pulse sharpen. If the rider dismounted, he would signal to the others waiting somewhere nearby. That would bring all 3 down on the cabin at once. The rider shifted his weight in the saddle. Judd tightened his grip on the rifle. Sora exhaled silently and reached for the curtain. Then the rider turned his head sharply, distracted by something behind him. Judd followed his gaze. Branches moved 2 ridges over. Another rider emerging from the trees. They were regrouping. The first rider tugged the reins and turned his horse away from the cabin. Sora froze, clutching the lantern, not sure whether to send the warning. Judd saw the direction they moved and understood immediately. "They found my tracks," he whispered to himself. Not hers. He lowered the rifle without firing. Shooting now would bring them charging back, and he needed time to anticipate their next move. He stayed hidden as the men rode out of sight, their silhouettes vanishing behind the rocks. When the last hoofbeat faded, Judd slid down the slope, moving quickly but staying low. He approached from the north, so Sora wouldn't mistake him for a stranger. When he reached the porch, he knocked once, sharp and familiar. The door opened instantly. Sora stepped back in relief, her shoulders trembling. "They were so close," she whispered. "I know," Judd said, closing the door behind him. "But they didn't check the place. They didn't know you're here." He removed his hat and scanned the room, making sure nothing looked disturbed. Sora stood in the center of the cabin, the lantern still in her grip, her breathing unsteady. Judd stepped toward her. "Show me your ribs." Sora blinked. "Judd, I'm fine. What happened out there?" "Let me see," he said. She loosened the blanket around her midsection, and he checked the bandages gently. Her breathing tightened when his fingers brushed the edge of the bruise, but she stayed still. After a moment, He nodded. You're healing, he said. Sora let out a slow breath. You didn't fire your rifle. If I had, Judd replied, all three would be at the door right now. They're smart. They're tracking slow. They'll come back when they think the place is empty. Her voice fell to a worried whisper. What do we do now? Judd stepped back and set the rifle on the table. We're finishing this today. Sora straightened. What does that mean? I'm not waiting for them to pick the hour or the ground, he said. I know where their camp is. I saw their horses, their tracks. They've split up again, covering 2 ridges. If they find us first, you'll be trapped inside this cabin with 1 door and no strength to ride. She held his gaze. You're going after them alone? He nodded once. I know the land better than they do. I'll handle them. Sora grabbed his arm with sudden intensity, her fingers tightening around his sleeve. You could die. Judd lowered his eyes for a moment, then lifted them again with quiet certainty. If I stay here and wait, we both die. If I go now, while they're separated, I choose how it ends. She didn't let go. I don't want the only person who's protected me to walk out and not come back. Judd stepped closer, her hand still gripping his arm. Look at me, he said in a low voice. She raised her eyes, her breath uneven. I came back once. I'll come back again. I'm not leaving you behind. Her grip softened, but she didn't release him yet. Why are you doing this? Nobody has ever, she struggled for the words. Nobody has ever chosen me over danger. Judd looked at her with a clarity that removed any doubt. I'm choosing what's right, and I'm choosing you. The words settled between them like a quiet vow. Sora inhaled sharply, not in fear but realization. She released his sleeve slowly, her fingers brushing down to his wrist before falling away. When you go, she said softly, I'll be watching the window until you return. He almost touched her cheek but held back, the restraint in his posture matching the storm of emotion she couldn't yet understand in her own chest. I know. Judd strapped his holster tight, checked the ammunition one more time, and slung the rifle over his shoulder. Before stepping outside, he turned to her again. If they get too close before I can stop them, the lantern stays dark. Don't draw attention. Sora nodded. And if they reach the door? Judd's voice dropped to a cold certainty she had never heard from him before. They won't. He stepped out into the early morning light, closing the door behind him. Sora watched through the narrow crack in the curtain as he scaled the ridge with steady, determined steps. He looked like a man who knew exactly what he had to do. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Sora remained near the window with the lantern ready, her heart pounding with every distant sound. Then, a single gunshot cracked across the hills. She froze, fingers clenching the curtain. The sound echoed for several seconds before fading into a still, aching silence. Another shot followed, farther away, then complete quiet. Sora pressed her hand over her chest, fighting panic. Judd, please be alive. The minutes dragged. She waited, breath shallow, ribs aching, fear twisting through her stomach. Finally, a figure appeared on the ridge. Judd. He walked slowly, not with the urgency of a man fleeing danger, but with the steady, grounded steps of someone who had finished what needed to be done. His hat was missing. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, but he was walking upright, carrying the rifle in a lowered grip. Sora pushed the door open before he reached it. He stepped onto the porch and leaned against the frame for a moment, catching his breath. It's over, he said, her eyes searching for wounds. Are you hurt? Nothing that won't heal, he replied. They won't come back. None of them will. Sora stepped forward, her hands trembling, and touched his arm gently. He placed his hand over hers, holding it there, grounding both of them. You came back, she whispered. I told you I would. She took a slow breath, feeling safe for the first time in years. Her fingers slid upward to his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath his shirt. Judd lifted his other hand to her cheek, brushing away the worry lingering in her eyes. You're staying here, Judd said, not as a command but as a promise. If you want it. Her voice broke, full of quiet relief. I do. He leaned down, closing the distance between them. Their foreheads touched first. A long moment of shared breath, shared fear, shared survival. Then Judd tilted her chin gently and kissed her, Slow, warm, unhurried, the kind of kiss that carried gratitude, longing, and something new forming between them. When they pulled apart, Sora rested against him, her forehead against his collarbone. "Judge," she said softly, "what happens now?" He wrapped an arm around her waist, careful of her ribs. "Now," he said, "you heal, and this cabin stops being just mine." She smiled into his chest, the first peaceful smile she'd worn in years. "Then it's our home." Judd looked out over the ridge, the danger finally gone, the land quiet again. And for the first time since losing his brother, the empty space inside him felt full. Two people who had survived everything the world tried to break had chosen to stay together.